The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Bridging Faith in the Fourth Estate.
Good evening, everyone. It's episode 187. I cannot believe it. And I have a guest tonight that I'm really looking forward to spending an hour with and talking about all kinds of things. And I know you're going to love it as well. His name is Mark Oppenheimer, and he is known for his work with the New York Times, This American Life, and something called Unorthodox, which is groundbreaking. I've not actually tuned into that, but we'll talk about that. He's a fascinating individual with a breadth of knowledge and a wonderful person to discuss these things with. Welcome to the studio, Mark.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Wade.
Well, it's wonderful. I just revisited our sneak peek that we did right before the show.
Yeah.
And was reminded of the conversations that we had. So I'm looking forward to getting into this. As we always do on Created in the Image of God, we like to get to know the real you, the you that, was shaped and formed by forces beyond your control, i.e. your parents and the environment in which you grew up. So tell us a little bit about the beginning and the very early years of Mark Oppenheimer.
Sure. Well, I was born in 1974 in New York City. My father was either in Columbia Law School or just out. I can't remember when he graduated, but he and my mother were about 5 years into their marriage. They are what I call a mixed marriage, insofar as he was from Pittsburgh and she was from Philadelphia. And in Pennsylvania, that's opposite coasts. They had met working for Senator Joe Clark, who was a Democratic senator. They were both working on the Hill. My father as an aide of some sort right out of college, and my mother in the secretarial pool, and had married at what now seems fairly young, 24 and 25. My mother's a bit older than my father. And my father was looking for a path, and he thought he would try law school. I don't think he ever had a great passion for the law, but it seemed like something sensible to do. And they still talk about their wonderful time in New York City, the 5 years or so they spent there. So I was born there, though I don't remember it. We left when I was almost 2 years old, right after my brother Daniel was born. Daniel's also a writer, by the way, and someone you should have on, Daniel Oppenheimer. And we left for Springfield, Massachusetts, where my father had a job teaching at a small, relatively new law school called Western New England College. And he was on the early faculty there. And so he was a young assistant professor at a law school, and my mother was a homemaker, and I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is in Western Massachusetts, though it's not the what's become the fashionable Western Massachusetts. It's not as far west as the Berkshires. Nobody has a summer home there. It's not the sort of bohemian paradise of Northampton or Amherst, where there are cool colleges and cool restaurants. It's a kind of hardscrabble, post-industrial mid-sized town akin to an Albany or a Rochester, New York, or a Worcester, Massachusetts, or a Bridgeport, Connecticut. All of these mid-sized towns that once had a lot of industry and were much larger, but then have shrunk considerably. So very heavily Irish Catholic in its orientation. The Irish political machine dominated the city. I always say that if you want to know what kind of city I grew up in, you should know that when it was time to play Little League Baseball, you had to pick which Catholic parish you wanted to play for. And that was true whether you were Catholic or not. So you played for Our Lady of Hope, Our Lady of Sacred Heart, St. Mary's Holy Name, whatever. The whole league roster of teams was organized by Catholic parish, with a few exceptions. So it was a um, a classic sort of small to mid-sized town upbringing. The older I get, the more I cherish it, the more I think it was a great place to grow up. I think my siblings feel the same way. I think we all have a lot of baked in nostalgia for Springfield, Massachusetts, home not only of us, but of Merriam-Webster dictionaries. It's the birthplace of basketball. It's the birthplace of Friendly's restaurants, Milton Bradley games, a few other things. And I left in, after high school to go to college, to go to Yale, and have never lived there since, except for, a week or a month here and there visiting my family. Or right after college, I moved home for a very brief period. But I had a very happy, fairly simple middle-class childhood in Springfield, Massachusetts. So I have often found in life, I found this in college and have often found it since, that even though I grew up with a lot of cultural privilege and a lot of education in my family, in certain ways we were atypical for Springfield. And unlike a lot of our neighbors, my father had gone to Yale. His father had actually kind of washed out of Brown, allegedly for gambling. Started Brown, but didn't make it through because, according to family legend, he was just playing poker all the time. But, it's a family that going back a couple generations had elite educations and a good amount of privilege, because of where I grew up and the neighborhood and who my friends were. I've just always felt that I came from a blessedly normal and average place. And so when in high school and then in college and in life since, I've met people who presumed that everyone had a second home or a 3-car garage or whatever. I've always felt pretty alienated from that level of privilege, even as, of course, all these things are relative. And I think there are people who would see the life I've led and say, you've been, you won the golden ticket. But I think that sense of being in certain ways, materially anyway, and in circumstances, and in terms of where I lived, being very profoundly normal has served me very well as a journalist. That is to say, I think I am equally at home talking to the very poor and the very wealthy, to the Jew and the Gentile, black and white. I came from a city, my middle school was literally a third white, a third black, and a third Hispanic. It was just sort of profoundly diverse in that way. And so I just feel like I was given the gift of kind of anonymous normalcy in my upbringing.
Well, a lot of things there to unpack, and I look forward to doing some of that as we go through. I got a couple of quick basic questions for you.
Yeah.
Your brother Daniel, I didn't catch it if you said it, older, younger than you?
Younger. Sorry, I'm the eldest of 4 children. And that was also kind of fun. I would say most of the families we knew were 1, 2, or 3 children. We did have one family we were friends with who had 5, but we were the big family, and it was really because my parents liked being parents and liked having kids. They didn't feel religiously or culturally compelled to have 4 children, but they just did.
Which is kind of funny when you mention, all the Catholics having to join a Catholic, but your family was large. So what was going on there?
We were more Catholic than I guess the Catholics. By that time, by the 80s, I'm sure there were families in town that for Catholic cultural reasons had, 4, 5, 6, and 7 children, but very few. And I don't remember many. I remember one such Catholic family, and then I remember 1 or 2 Orthodox Jewish families. There weren't many Jews in town at all, but there were, a Catholic family, a Jewish family, maybe a Mormon family who for cultural or religious reasons were very large. But of the people we knew and socialized with, we were on the very large end of things with 4 kids.
And in terms of Jewish, right? One of your parents was Jewish?
No, both.
Okay.
No, as far as we know, I'm Jewish all the way back to Mount Sinai. As far as we know,
Yep. Well, and you mentioned also in the pre-interview that you were raised in an environment that was almost intended to make you not be religious, but then somehow that didn't work.
Yeah,
I don't mean joking, but
Let me be clear. I would never say intended to.
Right.
If you were to write a novel in which somebody's ancestry unwittingly, unintentionally conspired to have a less religious home. My father's family were from a branch of Judaism that's often colloquially called classical reform. And this was the tradition going back to the 19th century that was fairly assimilationist in intent, and also highly Americanized. So there was a time when a lot of the temples in the classical reform wing of Judaism had Sunday services instead of Saturday. They adopted the Christian Sabbath. And some of them would call their rabbi reverend instead of rabbi, because they were trying to be American. And so my father came from that tradition. It was a tradition that had largely let Hebrew and Hebrew scripture lapse. They tended to do everything in translation, and they were just not, I would say, not particularly observant, though not in denial about their origins, just not deeply knowledgeable or committed to their practice. And then my mother's parents had come from Eastern European Orthodox families, but they both, my mother's mother and father, were members of the Communist Party in the 1930s and were very left-wing and kind of anti-religious for political reasons, though culturally they were Jewish and all of their friends were Jews, which is a very typical story on the American left. You know, there are many people who were communist or socialist and philosophically anti-religious, but all of their friends were Jewish. Or you would see this in Italian anarchist circles, the sort of Sacco and Vanzetti world, where they were deeply, profoundly anti-Catholic, but everyone they knew was Italian Catholic, or at least ancestrally Catholic. So you're right, I was not raised with a lot of religious practice, but certainly a good knowledge of my Jewish heritage.
Well, one of the things I want to unpack with you in this episode, and I absolutely want to get into the whole intersection of faith and fact, right?
Yeah,
the fourth estate in America, writing journalism. But I find this also very fascinating, because to me, and my first impressions of you, extremely favorable, perhaps partially because to me you seem to have this very interesting mix of really, really well studied, if you will, observant, a true journalist that's aware of what's going on around you, and yet you're processing this internally through your own experiences. And as I hear you describe your growing up, I hear, some investigative thought, some ambivalence, some analysis when you start bringing up like privilege, but we weren't really privileged and we kind of were. And so this is, I guess what I'm getting at now is, when you then say, well, there were communists who all their friends were religious, and there's this contradiction going on. There's a kind of a self-loathing, a distancing from who we are, and yet still being who we are. And I feel this going on today with this issue of privilege, right? And always having to compare ourselves to what somebody else does or doesn't have, or did or didn't have growing up, or in their experience.
Well, there are a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
I think let me pick off one of them. I think all children compare themselves. Some are lucky. I actually did less of that. I'm not somebody who has a lot of envy. And I went to a high school. I went to a private high school. I was a day student at a boarding school in Connecticut, and where a lot of the boarding students in particular were quite wealthy. And I never thought that they had better lives than I did. I never envied them or wished that I was among them, or really compared myself to them. Nevertheless, because I was an aware person, I was aware of different circumstances. And I think I was actually fairly unusual in how unenvious I was. I think that there were poor and middle class and even slightly upper middle class, but not rich students at my school who were quite sensitive to how much money some of the very rich kids had, and really carried that like a sack of rocks around with them. I didn't tend to. I was just interested in it. I think there's a lot of very overly plaintive and perhaps self-lacerating talk about privilege these days. And I hear where you're coming from, but that's not really where I'm coming from. I'm really being purely descriptive. I don't think people have to walk around thumping their chests or, wear a horsehair shirt or anything because of the privilege. But I think as a journalist and as a memoirist, as somebody who in all of my writing, in all of my nonfiction writing, really feels the job is to tell the truth and to tell it clearly. One of the facts of my life is that, I have more money than some and more education than some, less money than others, less education than others. That's as true as the fact that I'm sometimes the Jew among Gentiles. I'm sometimes the Jew among more observant Jews. We're all our own unique selves walking through, walking down gauntlets of other people who are all different in their own ways.
Well,
so to me, it's not, I wasn't making a value judgment. I was just saying that's one of the things that's true.
Exactly. And that's actually what I was trying to comment on in my very imperfect way. It's that it's a self-awareness that doesn't have to be self-loathing and shouldn't be
Yeah.
self-loathing, right?
I'm very
So
far from loathing myself. You know, it's funny
right,
because when you're a Jew writing about Jews, if you write anything negative, you write a story that covers other Jews in an unfavorable light, someone will accuse you of being a self-loathing Jew. And I
right.
always make the joke that nobody loathes themselves less than I do. I have no self-loathing. I hold myself in very high regard.
Well, but see, this is something I've struggled with, which is why I find it interesting, because I had a decidedly strange and probably unprivileged background in that I was kidnapped as a child in a domestic kidnapping, smuggled out of the country, separated from both parents, lived with an alcoholic uncle in Sweden.
Dang.
Was then living in a tent to get through my senior year of high school in Alaska. True story, right? And yet today I'm happy and I'm well adjusted and I have a wonderful life, and I'm constantly being accused of not being aware of my white privilege. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think you really understand that I didn't necessarily experience a lot of white privilege. I mean,
Yeah.
sure, there might have been some in some areas of life. You follow me? So
I do follow you. I think there is such thing as privilege, but it operates in many more and fascinating ways and
exactly.
different vectors than just race. So I
Amen.
do think, I mean, certainly it is the case that, you know, I think I have less ambient stress when I encounter law enforcement than some Black friends of mine. I think that's just true. It's also true that, you know, there are white people who have chronic illness and they'd probably, you know, take up the burdens of any other group of people to escape their chronic illness. And, you know, the greatest privilege I have is not racial or financial, but that I have a really even keeled, happy temper. I don't know if it's even keeled, but it's happy temperament. I don't suffer from any depression. And that's what a gift, right? When I look at people who have a lot of anxiety or a lot of depression and how, you know, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Jewish, Gentile, whatever, if you wake up sad most days, that it strikes me there are very few burdens as difficult as that one to carry. And I wake up happy pretty much every day. Not
So
every
as a
day,
happy
but
person, then what led you to get into religious studies?
um, you know, I never have a great answer for that. I always feel the answer that anyone, if they're being honest, would have when they talk about why they are interested in the thing they're interested in is just because they're interested in it. Do we really have much to say about what we're curious about? I mean, some people obviously can draw really straight lines. You know, this thing happened, you know, my mother was murdered by a bird and I became an ornithologist. Okay, right. Great. You know, you had bird trauma and now you study birds. But the friend of mine I have who's the most impassioned bird watcher, has no history with birds. He thought he would try it one day. It ended up being really interesting to him, and now he's a bird watcher. And why? Who knows why? It turned out to be a key that fit in the keyhole that was him. It just fit well.
Yeah.
And so I suppose I could say the fact that I hadn't had very few preconceptions of religion. I mean, my parents weren't particularly religious people, but they weren't hostile to religion. You know, we celebrated Hanukkah and Passover, but not many other holidays. I had a little exposure to Jewish practice, but not much. It was a kind of non-factor in a way that maybe meant that when I went into my first religious studies class in college, I had no baggage or preconceptions. And then when the class was extremely interesting and the lectures were really compelling, I just thought, wow, like I want to learn more about this, which is not something I had felt when I took a college physics class or a college evolutionary biology class or all of these other great classes. But I never thought I want to do 5 more classes or 20 more classes in this. And then I walked into American religious history from 1600 to the 1600 Civil War. And when but within the second or third week of class, I thought I want to take 10 more classes like this as soon as this one's done. It just seemed great.
Well, and then where did the progression come from religious studies into journalism and writing and
right?
So
I had always, I'd always loved writing. That was always a creative outlet for me as a very young child. I thought it'd be fun to write books, and I'd actually bought some blank journals, like bound books with nothing in them and written a lot in them and said, oh, this is my first book. And I had started a newspaper when I was 6 where I would write all the articles and have my dad photocopy it at his office and then hand them out to my 7 classmates. I was a pretty small elementary school, or 12 classmates, I don't know. And I always liked the idea of writing, printing, publishing, having something to say. I liked language. I liked words. I liked reading. So writing always seemed very appealing to me. And I pretty quickly developed the idea that I would either be that I wanted to write about religious studies. Something like I'd found the thing I wanted to write about. And then the question was, do I want to write about it as a scholar or as something like a journalist? And I did a PhD. I mean, I was on track to be a scholar and realized that it was, that I wasn't committed enough to the archival life, that I was a little more interested in being out of the library and out of the archives and with people. And I liked interviewing people more than I liked going through microfilm. And so it was really just, again, a sense of what am I well suited for? And what I seemed well suited for was writing about religion, but for a general audience rather than for a scholarly audience. And I think, another one of the great privileges I've had is I figured out really early in my life something that I would love to do, and I got to do it. And that could have gone totally wrong in other directions. There are people who never figure out what they want to do, or they figure out too late to really do it, because by the time they figure it out, they have a career in something else and they have financial obligations and it's very hard to pivot. Or the thing they want to do is almost impossible to do. I mean, if you want to be a professional sculptor, frankly, there probably aren't 50 sculptors in the country who can make a living sculpting. And, writing is a hard thing to make a living at, but it's not impossible. There are a few hundred of us who get to do it, maybe even 1,000. Whereas sculpting or modern dance, really hard. Acting, there are a lot of actors who make a living, but it's very random who makes it. Of every, I had good friends in college who wanted to go into acting, and the thing there is, it's so much turns on. Do you get cast in the right part early on? Do you find the right agent? Do you luck into the right, role? Do you have the right look? Do you have the look that's popular now? There's a lot more going on than just how hard you work and how talented are you. Whereas writing, if you're pretty good and pretty industrious and don't chicken out and go to run off to law school or consulting or something more safer, your odds are not terrible.
Well, awesome. I think that's a great intro to Mark Oppenheimer. We're going to take a very quick commercial break. And when we come back, I want to dive into a little bit of the meat of what it is that you do with all of that experience and all of that privilege of having, made some good choices in terms of aligning yourself with that which you love anyway, and finding a path through all that.
Sure.
So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. This particular little commercial is for a series that's being run that's kind of tangentially related to this. Very short. We'll be right back.
They said information would set us free. But what if it became our leash? In an age where media, power, and profit shape the very truth we see, Murtash Olson invites us to look deeper, to question the systems that trade freedom for control, and to remember that discernment is sacred. Freedom for sale, at Created in the Image of God.
That was sort of our first quick little demo of something that's going to be longer. We didn't have a video for you, so I thought I'd throw that in there because it kind of sets a nice little tone about some of the things that interest me. So you have this thing called Unorthodox. Tell us about that, and also Arc magazine.
Yeah. So Unorthodox wound down, but I'm happy to talk about it. It was my project for about 7 years until not too long ago. It was a podcast about American Jewish life and culture. We ended up doing 360 episodes, me and 2 co-hosts. We ended up with millions of downloads. And I think we counted something like 7 million downloads of 360 episodes by the end. And it was an attempt to, on a weekly basis, explore what was going on with principally American Jews of all kinds. And it was a pluralist space. We would interview, extremely observant, ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews in the same episode in which we'd interview a very, progressive, non-traditional Jews. We would interview, lesbian rabbis right after or before people who didn't think women should even be allowed to be rabbis. It wasn't principally about theology or religious observance. It was also about life and culture. And it was a great, I'm privileged. I mean, we would do live shows all over the country. Hundreds of people would turn out to see us do a live show where the three of us would talk and interview guests. And it was a lot of fun. I stopped doing it a bit before the Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023. And it would have been a hard show for me to keep doing after the attacks, just because there was so much bad news. And we tended to, we were a fun show. A lot of levity in our show. And so,
let me just ask a quick interjected question.
Sure.
If you had continued during that, there's another issue that I'm interested in, and that is polarization, right? Was there polarization within the Jewish community as there has been in the broader society around?
Oh, sure. Jews are very polarized about a lot of things. I mean, I think that the Jewish community is, in a sense, better than the Christian community at holding together. If you look at the Christian community writ large and say, at this point, what do, lefty Congregationalists have to do with?
Jews don't necessarily believe in hell, so they wouldn't necessarily have been condemning each other to hell over doctrinal differences.
We don't talk a lot about hell. I mean, they're very, that's a whole byway we could go down. I mean, the Jewish theology of the afterlife is, it's not non-existent. There is a Jewish theology of the afterlife, but it's diverse and obscure. There's no one agreed upon narrative for it. So no, but we don't, as a practice, go around saying people are going to hell. I mean, it would be much more, that it would be much more about, ostracizing, this Jew doesn't belong in my synagogue, or we're going to put them in harem, in ostracism, like what they did to Spinoza. I mean, it gets roughly called excommunication, but it's not really excommunication, because if you don't mind, I'll explain this. If you're a Roman Catholic and you're excommunicated, you're not really properly a Catholic anymore. Whereas you can't be made an un-Jew. I mean, Judaism is passed ancestrally from the matrilineal side. Some would say from the mother or the father's side, but historically from the mother's side. And you can't be un-Jewed. I always say it's like the Eagles Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Never leave.
And that's Judaism. So no, we're not. The fights aren't about condemning each other to hell. The fights are just radical disagreements on all sorts of things. Again, not as polarizing as, again, a sort of conservative Russian Orthodox priest put next to a feminist Lutheran pastor. I mean, from the liberal Lutheran denominations. If you look at Christianity as a big thing, you realize there are parts of it that don't speak to each other at all. I mean, they just have nothing to say to each other. One thing about Jews is we're a more tight-knit world because we have to be. There are only 12 or 13 million Jews in the world, which is extraordinary. I mean, there's really, hundreds of times more Christians and Muslims than there are Jews. And people don't realize that because Jews tend to play an outsized role in culture and in the news, and the Middle East plays such a role in the news. But there are very few Jews in the world. So, yes, but to answer your question, there was tremendous polarization, and part of what we enjoyed doing on that show was overcoming the polarization and saying we will talk to most anyone in the tent. So that show ended, and to answer your question, my latest project, I mean, I've had a lot of projects, is, in addition, the thing I'm always doing is writing, and I have 2 books underway. One is coming out in March, but as my day job, I'm editing a magazine called ARC, which is at arcmag.org, arcmag.org, which is produced by the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. And the mission of the Danforth Center is to get people thinking thoughtfully and learn in a learned and civil way about America, the intersection of American religion and politics, which is something I've been writing about for 25 years. So I was really thrilled that WashU invited me to restart and relaunch this journal. And so that's just been a great pleasure. And we are doing a podcast called ARC the Podcast, which is affiliated with the magazine, and the magazine is affiliated with the center. So we have a really wonderful project going on there. And this was all inspired by the work of Senator John Danforth, the Missouri Republican who left office a few years back, but who is a kind of great believer in civil discourse and civil society and how to talk across differences.
Well, and that's a critical topic, and one which I really try to focus on this show. The original subtitle of this show, Creating the Image of God, was The Role of Religion in Society. I changed it to Building Vibrant Communities to make it more diffused. But even when it was the role of religion in society, I avoided politics like it was against my religion, which it kind of halfway is. It's against my religion to be involved in partisan politics.
Yeah.
So we'll talk a little bit more about religion on this show than I probably have in 6 months on this show. And that's a good thing, especially when I actually just launched a series yesterday of nine articles that I wrote in a frenzy about the No Kings protests, because it suddenly occurred to me that Samuel, in the days of the judges, that's like a particularly chaotic period of Jewish history, ancient Israel, where it was, horrible. And it says at the end, in that day, there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Then you also have the story of Samuel and the children of Israel. And we talked a little bit about assimilation in a vague way a few minutes ago when you talked about your parents and their practice, and other Jews who even started keeping a Christian Sabbath, i.e. on Sunday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the word assimilation came to mind when you said that, right? So the children of Israel coming into the Holy Land, right? They wanted to be like the nations around them. And they said, we need a king. We want a king. And Samuel, the prophet, warned them against having a king. So I had this, idea to write this series through that lens of, wait a minute, do we want a king? Don't we want a king? What did the founding, fathers really say about the role of the president and how our society was different? And if we evaluated presidents throughout American history, which of them actually took us in the direction of kings, and which of them scaled that back?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So yeah, throwing all that out there, you've been working in this space, for 25 years, as you said, and you're writing Arc Magazine. So what's your take on what's going on today in the culture wars and the push and pull of American society?
Yeah,
that's a big question, I know, and there's no silver bullet answer. But
yeah,
what's your take
I think there are a number of unfortunate trends. I think that there is a desire. I think, look, it's not shocking to me that almost 250 years into the Republic, when again next year is 250 years, that a lot of people have sort of now take for granted how extraordinary the experiment in self-government and democracy is. Certainly, a lot of people forget that we fought, not me, not my ancestors, perhaps yours, but in a sense, our spiritual ancestors, are the founding fathers, and that generation fought a war to get out from hereditary leadership and arbitrary leadership, and to have more of a say in who the leaders were. And I think that, we've always had a tension in this country between people who want a heavier hand and more authority. And by the way, people who also revere monarchy in a sense. I mean, what is the fascination with the Kennedys, but a fascination with monarchy and a desire to have almost a secular, Americanized, non-monarchical royal family. You see the same thing with the Bushes. Again, it's not a Democratic thing or Republican thing. It's both. People, the idea that you should get a leg up in politics because of who your father was or who your husband was. I mean, I was extremely troubled that that Hillary Clinton was seen as a viable Senate and presidential nominee, she was an accomplished woman in many ways, but I didn't think that the first woman, that it would be a good thing if the first woman president was the wife of a former president. That is something you see a lot in much of the world. You see the Benazir Bhuttos, the Indira Gandhis, the women who succeed because of their family name. Again, they might be very gifted in many ways, but their careers are unimaginable but for whom they're related to. And I don't think that's a good thing in America. And again, I see it as a problem with, again, I respect Lynn Cheney, but again, we don't want the daughters and spouses and sons and husbands and wives of politicians to be the next generation of politicians. And you see that with the Trumps, who he's clearly hopes to have some sort of monarchy, hopes his kids will take over, is all about kind of the, nepotism and appointing. I mean, the fact that his son-in-law is so, and in the last administration, his daughter and son-in-law and his son. I mean, also like this sort of, and again, Kennedy did it with his brother, with RFK. And it's a strain we have of thinking that people deserve access to power because they're related to powerful people. I think it's hugely problematic. I mean, I guess it goes back to John Adams and John Quincy Adams. I mean, it goes way, way back. But I really think that it should disbar you from office if you're too closely related to anyone who's held office. And so I think we're in a moment where there's a kind of fascination with executive power, with kingship, with royalty, that doesn't serve us well and that isn't very American. I mean, I love People magazine. I love a good, pop culture magazine, but I hate how often they put the royals on the cover. And I always want to say, hey, I'm an American.
Yeah.
I'm an American. I don't care about the royals. I don't think we should,
Well, and that's one slice of it, and that's the appropriate slice to respond to. And I bring up kings in particular, but then you have the exact opposite slice in the current politics, in the current administration, the current rise of this president and this administration, and that is the so-called deep state, right? Which is, when I think of fascism, when I think of wanting no kings, I think of the book 1984, right? Which is a very different thing. That's not based on personality cult. You follow me? That's based on deep-seated ideology and the apparatus of control.
Yeah, well, we don't want that either. I mean, I'm not sure that that's ever existed outside of the cult of personality. I mean, one of the things you actually see is that countries that countries that foreground ideology tend to also foreground a charismatic leader who they see as the tribune of that ideology. So that's what you see with fascism in Italy. It's what you see with Francoism in Spain, obviously with Franco. And it is, I mean, although the intellectual architects of communism would not have wanted it to devolve into Leninism and Stalinism, that is what happened. So I do think that, where there is that kind of totalitarianism, it is striking how often, maybe not 100% of the time, but how often it goes along with the exaltation and coronation of particular leaders who are then almost retroactively called charismatic, even if they tend to not be fairly charismatic at all. But it doesn't, let's put it this way, it's not a system that sets up modest leaders who see themselves as purely in service to the ideology. It tends to exalt people who become very, very big personalities and who themselves are revered for their own personality.
Exactly. But in the current situation, I'm thinking it's the opposite, because most of the people that sent the current president in with whatever great popularity and charisma he does or doesn't have, he was sent as a wrecking ball, not as somebody who's going to exploit and use that apparatus.
Who knows, right? I mean, certainly his self-enrichment. I mean, you see he's asking for $200 million from the Justice Department now. I mean, his willingness to sell access. You may be, well, I think it's both, right? I mean, he was sent as a wrecking ball and by people who don't care that he also has loose ethics around self-enrichment.
Well, they feel like,
but also I don't, is that right that he is sent, I mean, you almost seem to be suggesting that his own personality is a subordinate factor, but in fact, what you actually find
let me rephrase. What I'm suggesting is that he's the Goliath who's sent in to slay David in this sense, right? Or, sorry, that's a bad analogy too. What am I actually trying to say here? He's simply the gladiator champion that is big enough, brash enough, and in this case, big enough because he's rich enough. So it doesn't matter if he, adds a few billions along the way, because that's how the gladiator champion got there in the first place, right? He would have never gotten there had he not been able to ride down his gold escalator in his gold-filled building. That's why he was able to be the champion to go in as a wrecking ball. So it's kind of a weird.
I mean, that's all true if you believe that stuff needed to be wrecked, but I don't. I think I think we have a great country. So I
I'm
mean,
not saying I
no,
believe
I
it
mean,
needs to be.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
right. I mean, yes, but that proceeds from a kind of nihilism. And of course, the saddest thing about his presidency was how often he demeaned America and said, we're a terrible country, we're horrible, demeaning, John McCain's not a war hero. I mean, the kind of, what was so interesting was how he actually managed to have a populism of disdain, of kind of anti-patriotism. We're bad at wars. We're bad at the economy. We're a bad country. Our cities are a wreck. Our cultures are a wreck. Our universities are a wreck. I mean, just radical disdain for the country. And I'm a patriot. I mean, I try to guard against idolatry because I think patriotism can very easily shift into idolatry. But I'm somebody who so kind of temperamentally loves America, perhaps beyond reason. I mean, perhaps uncritical, perhaps not critically enough, I guess is what I would say, because we should all be critical in our patriotisms. But and so I think, yes, look, I think everyone is different. I think Stalin was different from Hitler, and I think Hitler is different from Pinochet. And I think, all bad leaders are bad in their own ways. And I don't draw analogies. I don't think, well, this person's Hitler or this person's this or this person's that. I think that our current president, who was democratically elected, is different in a lot of ways. I think his mix of, as you say, kind of like David-like pretensions, but also, of course, part of the thing about Torah is that David was, a highly ethical and great man, right? That virtue was it's not that these people were perfect, but it's that they were virtuous.
And that's the great thing. That's the great thing about the Judeo-Christian history, right? There's this famous story, it, right? David, the ethical, philosopher king, if you will, of his day, poet king, whatever.
Right, poet king, right.
He found Bathsheba and sent her husband to his death.
Yeah.
Right. And then the prophet came to him and told this story about a sheep, and this poor man who had one sheep, and the person who had all these sheep and all this stuff stole it from him. And David was incensed, we need to do something. And then the bony finger of the prophet comes out and says, and you are that man, David. And the prophet did not get his head cut off. Right. David immediately recognized that the prophet was right, and he repented in dust and ashes. The awareness, the horror of what he had done came upon him, and it feels like we're going through that moment as a nation, for the last several decades.
I'm a small bore person. I don't have grand theories about the sweep of history. I think a lot of these things are contingent. I think if Joe Biden hadn't been so obviously senile, we probably would have a second term, and we wouldn't be having the same conversations, for better or for worse. I just think these things are often highly contingent. I'm
going now beyond the presidency. I'm talking about DEI and the whole thing about white privilege that we talked about, and what we're going through as a nation on a bigger, broader scale than who happens to be the president.
It's definitely, there seem to be calmer times and more intense times. I came of age, the 90s, the Clinton eras were sort of, we now look back and they seem almost radically calm in certain ways. And even though at the time they felt, epically contentious. And I think we are having a harder time talking to each other than we did then. And this has to do with, attention spans and social media and kind of radical polarization, the collapse of a moderate middle, and none of that has been good for us. So I think, on the other hand, I will say, things can turn on a dime. I mean, in the 1970s, it was okay to drive with, an open can of beer next to you, and by the 80s, the onus against drunk driving. What's that? And no seatbelt. I mean, these things, within 5 years, gay marriage went from seeming like a total impossibility forever to being the law, to being inevitable, seeming inevitable. Seatbelts, drunk driving, gay marriage, like there are things that turn on a dime, that turn against allowing kids to have smartphones out in schools, which a few years ago, I remember talking to teachers, they said, we can't fight this. We're all going to be on our phones all the time forever. Like, it's done. Don't even bother. And then a year or two later, all of a sudden, high schools across the country started banning phones. Things can change. Things change. Remember, Obama, it seemed like we'd never have another Republican president. The Democrats held both houses. He was president. Then he won again. And during Bush, people thought there'd never be another Democratic president, right? People think whatever they're in, it's sort of eternal and immutable, and they can't see past it. And the reality is we have no idea what's around the corner.
I'm reminded, a lyric came to mind, Paul Simon, Boy in the Bubble, every generation throws a hero up the pop charts, right? So when we come back, we're going to take another very quick commercial break. When we come back, I want to ask you if we lurch forward from ditch to ditch, right? As we talk about, where we're going next. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Mark Oppenheimer on Creating the Image of God.
In the heart of small-town America, where stories come to life and community bonds run deep, comes in the heart of small-town America, where stories come to life and community bonds run deep, comes a collection that goes beyond the ordinary. Introducing The Last American Editor Volume 2 by Ken Tingley. Step into a world where the meaning of life is explored through captivating stories that touch the soul. Ken Tingley invites you to embark on a journey of self-discovery and community connection. Each column, a window into the heart of small-town America, reflecting the experiences that shape us all. A testament to the power of storytelling, these columns stand the test of time, resonating with the challenges and triumphs we face today. These stories celebrate the strength of community, the love for self-discovery, and the bonds that unite us all. With a raw honesty that changes minds and touches hearts, The Last American Editor Volume 2 is more than a book. It's an emotional journey. Join us in exploring the pages that hold the essence of small-town America, a testament to the human spirit and the beauty of our shared experiences. The Last American Editor Volume 2 by Ken Tingley. Get ready to change your perspective and be captivated by the stories that define us. Pre-order now at soupllc.com.
Welcome back to Creating the Image of God. We're talking to Mark Oppenheimer. We're going through a whole host of historical and current issues at the intersection of journalism, faith, writing, and America. So, Mark, you were just sharing how, under Obama, it seemed like we'd never have another Republican president, and so on and so forth. Do we lurch forward from ditch to ditch? And will religion continue to play a role in American life, in the trajectory of America as a project?
What do you mean from ditch to ditch? Explain that to me.
Well, the pendulum swing, right? So, we sometimes go to extremes, right? That's what I mean, is that the pendulum swings and we end up in a ditch, and then, we learn something, and then we cross the middle of the road again on our way to get out of the ditch. And the next thing you know, we're in the ditch on the other side.
I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, it can often feel as if we're in ditches as a family, as a city, as a state, as a country, as a world. And on the other hand, if you look at, at a lot of metrics, health, life expectancy, leisure time, we're not doing so badly. We're not doing as well as we ought. And in some ways, we're not doing as well as some cases, we're not doing as well as we used to. It seems that life expectancy has sort of leveled off. It's not climbing up to the levels you'll see in certain European countries. But of course there is, I think the loneliness epidemic is real. I think people aren't spending enough time together. I think that a lot of people have retreated into their homes and out of communal spaces. So I have a lot of concerns, but also compared to, the lives that a lot of people led in prior centuries and that a lot of people lead throughout the world today, it's a pretty great thing to be an American right now for most of us. And so I think that I try to guard against a sort of false pessimism or hopelessness, which I just think is not necessarily grounded in reality. But I'm not, I don't have, I tend to think that, happiness doesn't fluctuate that much. And I tend to think that the other thing we have to guard against is a kind of false utopianism or faith in progress. All the talk about artificial intelligence right now, even leaving aside the potential downsides of it. I don't see that the upsides are ever going to come through. I mean, if you look at kind of some of the AI utopians, and it's going to cure all disease, and it's going to just eliminate the need for work, and I mean, this stuff is all nonsense, right? You know, it would be impossible to be happy all day, all the time. Anyway, that's not what human nature is like. You know, even, you know, if you can cure one disease and get out of poverty, and you'll still be annoyed the next day when your spouse looks at you crossly, or when your children spill the milk. I mean, we live in some ways from, you know, annoyance to annoyance, and that's not going to go away. And the idea that technology or progress can get us out of that is foolish. On the other hand, we have to be really grateful for the great stuff that there is. So I'm not, I don't engage in or believe in pronouncements about the sort of either cycles, which I think are often as random as they are predictable, nor do I think that we're sort of in dark times. I mean, there are things I think will get better, but relative to really dark times, I don't think these are dark times.
So then on the topic of religion in America, you know, having started your life, we talked about at the beginning, around a family who was kind of really close to senators and politics, but then you went into religious studies. The role of religion in American society, is it something that's lasting? Are we moving into a post-religious society?
No. I mean, the human religious impulse always manages to pop up again. You know, there are kinds of religions that probably will die out. I mean, there are religions that have died out. I don't think the Shakers are coming back. You know, I don't. I think the Scientologists are probably pretty close to being on their way out. But who knows what the hope is for the Congregationalists, you know, whose numbers seem to be falling and whose churches are closing. There are still several 100,000 of them, maybe more, but fewer than there used to be. And it's not looking good for a lot of mainline Protestantism. On the other hand, even in countries where all of the old churches have largely gone dormant, what you see is people interested in astrology and Wicca and nature religions and paganism or strange, you know, cults that partake of metaphysics in the way that religion does. You know, the human need for, or interest in, or fascination with the irrational or the subrational or the metaphysical seems to be pretty consistent and ineradicable. And I don't know that we'd want to eradicate it. I think when we try to eradicate it, we're probably making a mistake. I definitely think that some of our church forms in America are going to go away. I don't think, for example, that we're in the midst of, you know, several journalists recently have talked about us being in some sort of religious revival. I don't think the numbers bear that out. I don't think that the traditional churches are going to do much better than hold steady and tread water. They're not going to see huge numbers of new baptisms or conversions or whatever. But will people have an interest in metaphysics and spirituality and the irrational? Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and I've really appreciated you answering my particular questions. I'm going to go to the audience now and just throw a couple of questions out there so that we make sure that they get some of their questions answered here too. This is kind of a long one. It's 2 parts. I got to show both, and I'll read it. I don't know if you can see the chat, but you've written about communities that are both historically marginalized and deeply privileged in education or resources. How do you see these dual identities playing out in how people understand moral responsibility today?
Oh gosh, that's a great question, but a very broad one. I mean, let me pick one thread from it, which is, I regret to say that I think people who have a lot of privilege, I mean, in older times we would have just said wealth, right? You know, seem not to feel the responsibility of that as much as they used to, right? It used to be that there was this thing called noblesse oblige, and if you'd made a lot of money, if you were Andrew Carnegie, even if you'd made the money by being a rapacious, exploitative capitalist, part of how you atoned for your sins was you gave money to build thousands of libraries. I mean, you know, this is what you did if you were a Carnegie, was you built civic institutions. It is not my, and the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Mellons, I mean, the Vanderbilts, the great capitalist families, and in some would say robber baron families of 150 years ago, also built great institutions. They built churches and universities and libraries and parks, and they were philanthropists. It is not my sense that the current generation of new wealth feels that responsibility. That I mean, they give money to stuff, sometimes political candidates, sometimes nonprofits that think about effective altruism or artificial intelligence or other kind of things that don't necessarily have an immediate usefulness to a poor person. But are they building the next 1,000 municipal swimming pools or public libraries or parks? I don't think so.
Is that because the scale has dramatically shifted? Because I remember the whole Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, shaming all the other billionaires into giving away half their wealth kind of thing. And many of them started up foundations, but the scale of society has changed. So even though it feels like, well, we have all these billionaires and they're all, greedy and they're oligarchs. Well, but is the disparity of wealth, in terms of the scale of society, it's maybe not the same as those wealthy of the past that could literally build all those libraries. And do we need more libraries, kind of thing?
No.
You know what I mean?
Well, first of all, we definitely need more libraries.
Yeah.
No, I think it's the opposite, Wade. I think the concentration of wealth is greater now. I mean, the concentration of extreme wealth. If you look at there's something like it's some statistic. I'm getting this wrong.
There's 1,000 billionaires at least, right?
I think those 1,000 billionaires have more wealth than the bottom 50% of America. I mean, the level of wealth that the wealthiest have is much greater relative to the middle class than the wealth the Rockefellers had relative to the middle class. So, but that almost isn't the point. I actually don't think the math is that hard. Most of our municipalities could still use a new library building and a new municipal pool and a new park. And a lot of our, we still need more wildlife to be preserved. I mean, the tasks are in many ways the same. I mean, the idea that Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, who both may be on their way to being trillionaires, couldn't give transformative levels of wealth to 1,000 cities in America tomorrow is ludicrous. Of course they could. The idea that somehow they've been priced out of or that they couldn't be as effectual doesn't seem right to me at all. It strikes me that they could be at least as effectual because their wealth is so huge.
Interesting. I have to think about that some more. Thanks. Great perspective.
Look, I mean, it's like the old, preacher William Sloane Coffin, the great Yale chaplain, said to me, if you're rich and you give away money, the credit you get shouldn't be about how much you give away, but how much you have left, right? So, I mean, if you have $100 billion, you give 20 billion away, I'm not impressed. You have $80 billion left. If you have $100 billion and you give 100 billion away, then I'm impressed. I mean, the question is, are you willing to sacrifice anything? It's not.
Jesus said the same thing when he praised the widow's mite, right? They gave from their abundance and she gave from her need, her want.
I'm sure look, the reality is the rich people who are really giving to the point where it hurts probably aren't asking for credit for it. They're probably not naming things after themselves. And so we don't know who they are. And they deserve all the praise. The people who slap their names on things and want the building name, they only give the money if the building gets renamed for them, are not the people who impress me.
Yeah, that's crazy. Here's an exchange between two members. I just want to get your take on it. Gina says, culture as a whole, when it comes to Christianity, is almost like picking your favorite football team. And then Chloe responded, that's because when we strip religion from culture, people often try to find meaning in politics or identity, but those frameworks aren't built to carry existential weight. We got some folks from Planksip that are philosophers here.
I'm not sure I understand how the latter responds to the former, but I will say that it is this speaks to the politics not built to carry existential weight. we are over invested in politics now, right? Somebody smart said, a lot of the people who are watching highly politicized TV, your Fox News types, or listening to talk radio, and in the past 20 or 30 years have become political junkies, 50 years ago would have been fairly indifferent to politics, except in election season. They would have tuned in every 2 or 4 years, and all their attention would have been spent paying attention to, the National Football League or their local Elks Club or whatever. And we've sort of lost the interest in baseball has gone way down. Interest in little leagues has gone way down. Interest in fraternal associations, Rotary, Els has gone way down. And for many people, what's replaced it is an obsession with politics, which is why you get those, which is why a Charlie Kirk memorial is a stadium event. And funerals, I have nothing against people mourning anyone. I don't mean to demean that event in any way. I didn't watch it or pay too much attention to it. But for a lot of people, instead of going to stadiums to see rock bands or sports teams, they want to go see someone who has a political identity. And that's not good. We actually should be less politicized and more interested in other parts of our lives.
Here's one more comment. Thank you for that. Here's one more comment. You could argue that every presidency is a national confession. We elect the leader who reflects our current state of soul.
Yeah, there's a truth to that, but the problem is it seems like a kind of deterministic, mystical statement. But honestly, again, if Biden hadn't been senile, he might have won. Even Harris, who seems to have lost badly, it's like if you flip 1.5% of the votes from this column to this column in certain states, you have a different presidency. So the idea that this was our soul, if the weather had been a little bit different that day and Harris had won, would you say our soul was different? That seems overly determined in a certain way.
Yeah, I'm reading it differently. To use the Biden example,
yeah,
in year 3 of his presidency, even some of those who were rabid supporters of his for whatever reason had to be looking and saying, what did we do electing this guy? And do we really want to have him? Do we really think we can put him back in the White House at this point for 4 more years? So it's not so much, mystic. It's more, again, confessional. It's kind of looking back and saying, oh yeah, it's an awakening.
I don't think I ever knew anyone who was a rabid Biden supporter. I don't think he inspired that kind of passion.
Well, I didn't want to put it in the negative. I didn't want to say.
I would question your premise from both sides, but a lot of people would have elected him again because, look, let me be clear. The reason to elect presidents is because you believe in their policies, right? So if you believe in the labor movement, if you believe that Teamsters deserve better contracts, Biden, the people, then you care about who gets appointed to the National Labor Relations Board. And Biden appointed a very different set of people to the NLRB than Trump has appointed. There are real differences there. So, again, they had real differences in whom they appointed Supreme Court, and therefore, and abortion policy changed in very material ways because of it. Now, I'm not saying right versus right. People can have whatever single issue they vote on or whatever 5 issues they vote on. I will do business with all of them. I'm really not saying, I'm not making value judgments here, but I am saying the idea that presidents are sort of dream catchers for our soul, or that they speak to yearnings or whatever. I know some people vote that way, but that's stupid. Because actually presidents change policy and affect our lives in profound ways. And if you're a conservative, you should want a president who's going to push things in a conservative direction. If you're a liberal or progressive, you should want the president going to push things in that direction. And if you or you sit out the election, you decide they're both hopeless, that's fine. But really what bothers me about a lot of it, I don't like mystical mumbo jumbo that talks about politics as soulcraft. It's not. It's about building bridges. Literally, literal bridges, not metaphorical ones. It's about infrastructure and union ratification and education funding and abortion policy. It's about policy. And so, honestly, does religion touch down on that in certain ways? Sure, of course it does. It informs who we are and what we value. But at the end of the day, presidents are policymakers. And the judges whom Trump appoints are making different policy in the land than the ones Biden appointed, or in some cases not. But those are the questions you want to ask. A lot of people don't want to do that work. A lot of people don't actually understand what a tariff is, whether you're pro-tariff or anti-tariff. The question is, do you know what it is and what it does? And the problem with sort of speaking about presidency as confessional or soulcraft or mystical, or does it take the temperature of the times, is it's actually what it does is it changes who proposes the budget to Congress. And I think that's really important. That's, if you take government seriously, if you think we should be self-governing, as a democracy or a republic, you have to pay attention to the actual policies of stuff. You have to read stuff and care about it, not just feel. It's not about vibes.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Do you feel that sort of ground, I'm going to call that groundedness for lack of a better word, that kind of groundedness, I'm laughing at myself now because I'm turning it back to religion, but this show is called Creating the Image of God.
Sure.
That groundedness comes from your Jewish heritage and your Jewish approach.
No, it comes from hope. I mean, you're asking me which.
Well, no, I get
Zygos my own greatness. Groundedness. No. Go ahead. No, sorry.
The Jewish faith approaches the study of the Word of God perhaps a little differently than some others.
I will say this. Well, I will say this. I mean, we certainly are not. It's not a very Jewish thing to say, well, none of this matters because we'll all get ours in the afterlife, right? So there is a slice of Christianity, it's a small one, that really doesn't care much about policy because they think that, this is just a brief, flash in the pan compared to eternal life. And so who cares about it? That's not most Christians. Most Christians I know do care about policy. Yeah, I don't know. I think my groundedness there comes from, if anything, it comes from my journalism, which is when you talk to actual, people who have been shot, in the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, when you do work, when you interview an opioid addict or someone who's been abused by a priest or somebody who narrowly escaped a mass murder or whatever, when you talk to people, you think, what would have made you safer? What would have made your community more resilient? Oh, funding this, having a law about that, rezoning this, it's actual policy. So, look, religion has its place. I mean, I spend my life reading and writing about religion, but it doesn't tend to bring much wisdom to bear on, how a budget should be written, how a budget should align with whatever your priorities might be. And if your priorities are better mass transit, as one of mine is, there's not a Jewish way to mass transit or and a Pentecostal Christian way to mass transit. There's just good mass transit.
Awesome. One last question from the audience, and then I'll we're
Sure.
out of time. I could keep going forever, but
Yeah,
I don't
me
want to
too,
impose
man.
on you. I don't want to impose on you. So, and I want to give you a chance to sort of leave your final thoughts here as well. So,
Oh, that's kind
from
of you.
Selling England by the Pound, what's one misconception you wish everyone would drop when they hear religion in America?
I guess we all tend to overstate the level of religiosity in America. So right now there are people saying that we're in the midst of a revival. I don't think there's evidence for that. I think foreigners tend to think Americans are all in church all the time. Even people who are very religious, it's a pretty small minority of people who are in church weekly. So you'll see, more people are in church monthly or bi-monthly, but and then when you quiz those people who are very religious, say, can you name how many of the 10 commandments can you name? How much biblical literacy do you have? It's often quite low. That for many people, religion is an approved cultural style in America in the way that it's not an approved cultural style in Norway, for example, or Australia as much. But that doesn't mean that we are, a deeply, profoundly religious nation. I think that very often what is seen as religious is just a certain kind of politics cloaking itself in what they see as the hortatory rhetoric of religion.
Awesome. Thank you. So, what has been unsaid? What did you maybe hope to share when I invited you to come on the show that
I think we hit it all.
Nothing.
I think your questions are so good and your audience's questions were so good. And I think we hit it all.
Is there something we should still dive into that you feel like, yeah, let's make sure we don't forget this as we head out the door?
I think, I guess what I would say is that a mistake that some people interested in religion make is they feel that religion is in tension with reason and rationality and evidence seeking. So, and they don't appreciate the proper spheres of evidence gathering. I mean, I'm a journalist. I go to synagogue once a week, sometimes twice, sometimes more. Like I'm a religiously engaged person. I'm also someone who thinks that the truth about vaccines or climate change or light rail or infrastructure or military effectiveness or whatever are not things that have anything to do with religion. If we want to get at those, we have to talk to people who have actual expertise, actual authority. We have to read a lot, and that's a pretty it's a separate magisterium. These are separate realms of knowledge that religion can't really help us with much. And so I think that, when I'm talking to audiences that define themselves as religious or spiritual, I want to say that's great, but actually the work of being a citizen is primarily not a religious commitment. Your religiosity might help you be a citizen, or it might hinder it. But the work of citizenship is actually is a different
independent
kind of
of that.
Is pretty independent and is a different kind of labor.
Yeah. I absolutely want to give you the last word, but I want to just add something to that first, and then give you the last word. So for me, taking climate change, for example, I get, and I come from a more conservative fundamentalist, deeply, that sort of whatever you called it, mystic craft, whatever, feeding that in. I come from that place. So for me, to go back to the book of Genesis and read that when God created Adam, right? Not that I believe it's necessarily a literal story. That's not the point. But the message of that story is he created Adam and he placed him in the garden to dress and keep the garden, right? Then he gave him Eve after that, created Eve from his rib. And then he gave them a commandment, and that commandment was be fruitful and multiply, right? Which we've not really had much problem keeping that commandment. And so now we're in a place where, climate change and whether it's really anthropomorphic or not, depending on how we view that, or whether the solutions being proposed are the right ones. The point is, we're teetering, it's obvious we're teetering on the brink of us having become the most invasive species the world has ever seen, to the detriment of everything else. You follow me? So for me to go back and tie it to that right, to use the German word, that origin, that genesis, is deeply powerful.
I hear that, and certainly hear a lot of, you hear a lot of talk in Jewish environmental circles about Ba'al Tashchit, which is the commandment to sort of to guard and protect your resources and to steward them. There's a lot of Jewish environmentalism that trades on the same sort of thinking, and I think that's fine. I think if that's what inspires people to do it, I only mean that the knowledge and the tools that we'll have are probably not in the Bible. They're in the reason that God, as you see God, however you see God, you should concede that God gave us, a mind and reason and empowered us to do science, and they're going to come from that set of tools, not from scriptural tools. So, but absolutely, people should be motivated by a sense of stewardship and compassion for all of God's creatures, and a sense that we both want to multiply our species, but also leave our children and our descendants an earth worth inhabiting, and all of that. I certainly think that's a spiritual endeavor, but it's also one that requires some secular tools.
Absolutely. Amen. So
Amen.
Mark, yeah. So Mark, thank you so much. Any final words, having responded to my last minute interjection there?
No, I think this is great. I hope people will check out arcmag.org and sign up for our newsletter and our podcast and all of it, and just stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely will be reading an article tomorrow, and putting those links in. This has been just fun and really educational for me. I've learned a lot in this, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective with me and the audience. So there's just one more thing to do, and that's air the sneak peek for next week's show. And Mark, thank you so much. It's been just a joy and pleasure. For the audience, remember, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. Here's the sneak peek for next week. We'll see you all there, same time, same place, 8 p.m. Central Time, for Creating in the Image of God.
Peace.
Hey everyone, it's Wade Franson here with a sneak peek. airing on for the show that will air on October 28th, right before Halloween. And we've picked an interesting guest for you. His name is David Zoll, and he is the founder and now the director of Mockingbird Ministries, which is an outlet that produces podcasts, print books, print materials, and has a very thriving website because they have a unique approach to reaching people with the gospel. I'm not going to tell you why they chose the term Mockingbird for their ministries, but we are going to mix it up a little bit. Welcome to the studio, David.
I'm so happy to be here, Wade. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm honored to have met you and to learn about the unique work that you're doing and how you're reaching people. And you shared with me that it started with a group of pastors. I'm not gonna say disgruntled, but who found it necessary to sort of chart a new path along the razor's edge between what was going on in churches, in ministries, partly as part of the culture wars and people being divided.
Yes, we wanted to make the grace of God, the main thing, and not other sort of political or cultural concerns. And so we had a lot of energy, probably a lot of hubris. We were younger at the time, but we set out on this weird multimedia mission to proclaim the grace of God in fresh and creative ways.
Well, and I was attracted by the name. And when I looked at your website and looked at some of your work, you weave in these pop references like, lay down your weary tune and tangled up in grace, which evoked for me Bob Dylan and a band called the Mekons. I don't know if you know who they are. These are not exactly mainstream. And up on your shelf was some stuff from Hot Chocolate. So how do you walk that razor's edge? Do you have critics about the fact that you're weaving in pop culture references?
Well, my sense of people alive today is that pop culture is enormously important, even if they want it to be or not. And you have to speak the language that people speak, but most of all, you have to speak the language that's authentic to you. And so if I'm going to be talking about my actual life and my relationship with God, my points of reference are going to be the ones available to me. And most of those come from pop culture. It's not to celebrate pop culture sort of willy-nilly or to venerate it in some way or adopt it make it into a tool. It's more just being authentic, using what the reference points and the language that comes naturally when we want to speak about ourselves and the world around us. But yes, we do have critics of it, but I think people overall are generous about the use.
Well, it's wonderful. I mean, Bob Dylan wrote one of the greatest simple songs ever written called "You Got to Serve Somebody." It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you still got to serve somebody. I mean, that's a powerful statement, and it's ultimately true. You know what I mean? So anyway, we look very much forward to having you on the show, David. And for the audience, remember, October 28th, 8 p.m. Central Time for the special Halloween episode of Created in the Image of God. We will see you there.